Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Wade, who's been supporting this channel as a General tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Wade, so again, Wade, thank you so much. And for the personalized deck tech, Wade chose Sydri Galvanic Genius with a vehicles theme. Sidri Galvanic Genius is a 2/2 human artificer for white, blue, black. She has pay a blue, target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost until end of turn. And by paying white, black, target artifact creature gains death touch and lifelink until end of turn. So Sidri actually interacts with vehicles in a very interesting way. Vehicles start off as non-creature artifacts, and if you crew them for their crew cost, you can utilize them as a creature, and their power and toughness is already listed on the card. But in a way, Sidri can get around that crew cost by just paying a blue. However, one thing to keep in mind that when you do that is that the listed power and toughness on the vehicle doesn't matter. Sidri's ability overrides that. So instead of it being the listed power and toughness, its power and toughness are going to be each equal to its converted mana cost. Regardless, getting around the crew cost on a vehicle can be incredibly impactful. Because keep in mind, though those vehicles might not keep their power and toughness, they keep everything else about them. So any keywords, abilities, triggers, etc., they're keeping. And of course, Sidri also has the ability to give them death touch and lifelink until end of turn. So yeah, Sidri is a fantastic vehicles commander, even on a budget. And for this deck, I'm going to be utilizing the budget restriction that every single card in the deck has to be less than $1, and in this case, it actually can include the commander. So what cards and strategies are we going to be utilizing? Well, let's jump into it to find out. First up, when it comes to mana rocks, we're going to be utilizing the diamonds that we can. Each of these cost 2 mana, come into play tapped and tap for one of our colors. And like I've said before on many episodes, I want to run efficient mana rocks, and I want to get at least half the amount of mana back that I put into them, so these are perfect. And speaking of 2 mana rocks, we're also going to be utilizing 2 of our signets with Orzhov Signet and Azorius Signet. Each of these cost 2, and by paying 1 and tapping them, they add 2 of our colors. Now, obviously, I would be including Dimir Signet if it wasn't nearly $3, so Wizards, please reprint Dimir Signet. Regardless, another budget mana rock that we're going to be utilizing in this deck is Sphere of the Suns. It comes into play tapped, and it can essentially tap for 1 mana of any color 3 times. But next up, we've got some mana rocks that tap for a colorless with Ebony Fly, Liquid Metal Torque, and Prismatic Lens. Ebony Fly enters battlefield tap, but we can also pay 4 to roll d6, and then until the end of the turn, it becomes an XX insect with flying, and it can attack to make something else have flying. So when we need it, this can help us get a creature through a lot of the time. And then on top of tapping for a colorless, Liquid Metal Torque can make target non-land permanent become an artifact addition to its other types until end of turn. Keep in mind that we can utilize this in a very interesting way with our commander. Maybe someone casts a Wrath to destroy all the creatures on the board, well, we can turn someone's enchantment into an artifact, and then our commander can make that non-creature artifact into a creature. And then Prismatic Lens taps for a colorless, and we can also utilize it to filter our mana. But on top of these mana rocks, we also have a creature and some vehicles that can help us ramp too. Chief Engineer says, artifact spells you cast have Convoke. With a vehicle-centric deck, we've got a ton of artifacts, and now our creatures can help us cast those. And then Colossal Plow can work very well with our commander. It has, when it attacks, add white, 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 and you gain 3 life. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Now, although this is just a 2 mana vehicle, it has a very high crew cost, so usually you don't get to utilize this early in the game. But again, with Sidri, we can just pay a blue and make it into a 2/2 creature, and yeah, just attack. And an opponent might be hesitant to block it even if they can, because again, Sidri can give it Death Touch and Lifelink. And then Cultivator's Caravan is essentially just a vehicle mana rock. It has tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. But now that we've talked about ramp, of course we've got plenty of other vehicles outside of these 2 to go through, so let's jump into those. Now, when it comes to utilizing vehicles with Sidri's ability instead of crewing them, some get more powerful, some get less powerful, and some pretty much stay the same. In Heart of Kiran's case, though, it definitely is less powerful if we decide to utilize Sidri's ability instead of crewing it. It's a 4/4 flying vigilant vehicle that costs 2, and it's got a crew cost of 3, so again, if we actually utilize Sidri's ability, it's just going to be a 2/2. Regardless, one thing that Sidri is very effective at is giving us options. For example, if we've got a 3-mana vehicle in play like Aethersphere Harvester, we can utilize Sidri's ability to make it into a 3/3 creature, and then it can actually just crew Heart of Kiran for us. So if we have a vehicle that is much more powerful when it's crewed, we can utilize our other vehicles to crew it. Regardless, Aethersphere Harvester might be one that you actually want to attack with because it's a flying vehicle that when it comes into play, you get 2 energy counters, and you can pay an energy counter to give it lifelink until end of turn. Keep in mind, though, that by utilizing Sidri's ability to make this into a creature, you do lose some toughness, but you don't lose any power. And then there's Daredevil Dragster, which says at the end of combat, if Daredevil Dragster attacked or blocked this combat, put a velocity counter on it. Then if it has 2 or more velocity counters on it, sacrifice it and draw 2 cards. Next up, we've got some more 3-mana vehicles with Mobile Garrison, Raider's Carve, and Peace Walker Colossus. Mobile Garrison says, when it attacks, untap another target artifact or creature you control. So this can help us untap another vehicle or another creature to keep it back on defense, or, we can untap a mana rock to give us some more mana in a turn. And speaking of giving us more mana, Raider's Carve says, when it attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. And then Peace Walker Colossus is kind of like our commander, but different in a way. By paying 1 in a white, another target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Now, unlike our commander, this ability costs 2 mana instead of 1, but there is one key difference. Unlike our commander's ability, this ability doesn't override the vehicle's power and toughness that's listed. So it's more so like paying the crew cost instead of entirely sidestepping it. Regardless, we've got one more vehicle at 3 mana with Renegade Freighter, which says when it attacks, it gets ++1 against trample until end of turn. And then at 4 mana, we've got Untethered Express and Oval Chase Dragster. Untethered Express has trample, and whenever it attacks, we get a ++1 counter on it. And keep in mind that this vehicle has the exact same power and toughness whether you crewed it or whether you utilize Sidri's ability to make it into a creature. Which is definitely not the case with Oval Chase Dragster, which if you crewed it would be a 6/1 with trample and haste, but if you utilize Sidri's ability, it's a 4/4 with trample and haste. But next up, we've got some more 4-mana vehicles with Bomat Bazaar Barge, Fleetwheel Cruiser, and Thundering Chariot. The Barge very simply says, when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. And then when Fleetwheel Cruiser enters the battlefield, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, so we get it as a 5/3 with trample and haste without actually having to pay the crew cost or paying Sidri's cost for the first time. Next up, Thundering Chariot actually gets more powerful when Sidri's ability is utilized. It's a 3/3 with first strike, trample, and haste, but again, it costs 4 mana, so it's going to be a 4/4 with Sidri. Next up at 5 mana, we've got Enchanted Carriage, Iridara Express, and Dusk Legion Dreadnought. When Enchanted Carriage enters the battlefield, we get 2/1/1 white mouse creature tokens, and again, this one's also one that gets more powerful as a 5/5 instead of a 4/4. Iridara Express, though, is one that gets less powerful as a 5/5 with menace instead of an 8/6 with menace, but still an effective attacker. And then Dusk Legion Dreadnought kind of meets in the middle. Instead of being a 4/6 with vigilance, it would be a 5/5 with vigilance. And finally, let's talk about Ballista Charger at 5 mana, Demolition Stomper at 6 mana, and Parhelion 2 at a whopping 8 mana. Ballista Charger says, when it attacks, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Demolition Stomper is a 10/7 if we crew it, and if not, it's going to be a 6/6, but regardless, it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. But the greatest vehicle in this deck for Sidri's ability has got to be Parhelion 2. It costs 6 white, so yeah, 8 mana, which is a ton, but when we get it into play, we can get a ton of value out of this. It would just be a 5/5 with Flying, First Strike, and Vigilance, but again, with Sidri's ability, it's an 8/8. On top of that, whenever it attacks, we get 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with Flying and Vigilance that are attacking. So yeah, with Sidri, this can hit for a ton and help us hit even harder by giving us more and more angels. Regardless, we've got some ways to make all of our vehicles even more effective and hit even harder. First up, there's Tempered Steel, which is an enchantment for 1 white that says artifact creatures you control get +2/+2. This is an extremely efficient and effective 3-mana anthem that can really pump our vehicles. Next up, we've got the Antiquities War, which is a saga. Its first and second lore counters say, look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it in your hand, then put the rest of them on your library in a random order. On top of giving us some card advantage, though, its third lore counter says, artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. So this is kind of like a mass Sidri ability effect. But in some cases, our vehicles are going to be even more powerful than they would be. And of course, instead of having to utilize our mana for Sidri's ability, we can utilize it for other things. Like Aeronaut Admiral, which says, vehicles you control have flying. so this can be a fantastic way to get a lot of damage through with our vehicles. We also have some ways to protect our vehicles as well in various ways with Lochiel, Bronze Guardian, and Leonin Abundus. Lochiel says, prevent all combat damage to be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control, and whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Being able to swing freely with our vehicles and not worrying about them dying in combat is huge. And again, keep in mind that our commander can give them Death Touch and Lifelink, so our opponents are going to have a really hard time blocking. Next up, there's Bronze Guardian, which has Double Strike, Ward 2, and other artifacts you control have Ward 2. On top of that, its power is going to be equal to the number of artifacts you control, and yeah, we're going to have plenty of those in play a lot of the time. And then Leonin Abundus simply says, artifacts you control have hexproof. So while we can still target our vehicles with things like our commander's ability, unfortunately for our opponents, they can't. Of course, we can also protect ourselves and our vehicles with counterspells with things like Negate, Neutralize, and Stoic Rebuttal. Negate's going to counter target non-creature spell, Neutralize counters any spell, and it's got Cycling for 2, and Stoic Rebuttal can counter any spell, and it's going to cost 1 less to cast if we've got 3 or more artifacts. Which again, most of the time, we're going to meet that requirement. Regardless, now let's move on and talk about some ways to generate card advantage with this deck. First up, there's Shram Senior Edificer, which says, whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. This can generate us a ton of card advantage throughout the game as we cast our vehicles. And we've even got some vehicles that can give us some card advantage as well, like Silent Submersible and Weatherlight. Silent Submersible says, when it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, draw a card. And then Weatherlight has Flying, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we look at the top 5 cards of our library and we can reveal a historic card from among them and put into our hand. Keep in mind that historic cards count artifacts, legendaries, and sagas, so yeah, a lot of options off the top of our library that we can get. One of which is Cosima, God of the Voyage, which can help us out in multiple ways. She has at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile Cosima. If you do, it gains whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. If Cosima is exiled, you may put a Voyage counter on it. If you don't, return Cosima to the battlefield with X +1 counters on it and draw X cards or X number of Voyage counters on it. So this is kind of like a landfall draw spell in a way. But this is actually an MDFC god, and on the other side, we've got the legendary vehicle, the Omen Keel. This says, whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library. You may play lands from among those cards as long as they remain exiled. So each side can help us out in different ways. And then next up, there's Conqueror's Galleon, which has, when it attacks, exile it at the end of combat, then return to the battlefield transformed under your control. It turns into the Land Conqueror's Foothold, which can do a lot of things. It can tap to add a colorless, we can pay 2 and tap it to loot, 4 and tap it to draw, and 6 and tap it to return target card from our graveyard to our hand. But of course, we also just have some solid draw spells with Sign in Blood, Read the Bones, and Painful Truths. Sign in Blood makes target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Read the Bones has us scry 2, then draw 2 and lose 2. And then Painful Truths can make us draw up to 3 cards and lose 3 life. Next up, we've got Behold the Multiverse, Thirst for Knowledge, and Thoughtcast. Behold the Multiverse has Scry 2, Draw 2, and it's got Foretell for 1 and a blue. Thirst for Knowledge has us draw 3 cards and discard 2 cards unless we discard an artifact. And then Thoughtcast can cost as little as just a blue because it's got affinity for artifacts and it says draw 2 cards. And finally, we're going to be running Fact or Fiction, One with the Machine, and Dance of the Mance. Fact or Fiction says read the top 5 cards of your library, and opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put 1 pile in your hand and the other in your graveyard. One with the Machine can draw us a ton of cards in this deck. It says draw cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among artifacts you control. And then Dance of the Man says return up to X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If X is 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in this or the other types. Essentially, this can help us get a ton of vehicles back and even make them permanently into 4/4s if we want. But now that we've talked about how this deck's going to work and our plans for it, how do we throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? First up, there's the Part of the Realm, which is going to bounce target non-land permanent back to its owner's hand, and it's got a Foretell cost of a blue. And then Into the Realm can also bounce a non-land permanent back to its owner's hand, and if we kicked it, we draw a card. But then we've also got some exiling effects with Despark, Forsake the Worldly, and Crush Contraband. Desparks can exile target permanent with converted mana cost 4 or greater. Forsake the Worldly is going to exile target artifact or enchantment, or we can cycle it for 2. And then Crush Contraband says choose one or both, exile target artifact or exile target enchantment. Next up, we've got the Mass Bounce spell Aether Gale, which is going to bounce 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands. And then Slash the Ranks can be a fantastic one-sided board wipe in this deck. It says destroy all creatures and planeswalkers except for commanders. Again, our vehicles can get around this because if they're not crewed or if our commander didn't turn them into creatures, they're not creatures. Whereas our opponent's creatures aren't gonna be so lucky. And then Cleansing Nova is also pretty flexible. It says choose one, destroy all creatures, or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. But then another potentially one-sided board wipe is Time Wipe, which says return a creature you control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. So again, we bounce Sidri back to our hand and destroy all creatures, and our vehicles at the time are not going to be creatures. Next up, there's Route, which can be a great surprise board wipe at instant speed because we can cast it as though it had flash. If we pay 2 more to cast it, it's going to destroy all creatures and they can't be regenerated. Now, as effective as all these cards are, there's still one card in my opinion that stands above the rest, and that's going to be the golden pig of this deck. And the golden pig for this deck is Caltrops. Caltrops is an artifact for 3 that says whenever a creature attacks, Caltrops deals 1 damage to it. This card might not seem like much, but it is incredible with Sidri. As long as we've got the right mana up, this can essentially shut our opponents out from attacking. By utilizing our commander to turn this into a creature, and then by subsequently giving that creature Death Touch and Lifelink, yeah, that's pretty powerful. It deals 1 damage to all those attacking creatures, and because it has Death Touch, those creatures just die. Oh, and we gain 1 life for each of those attacking creatures too. So yeah, this is an incredibly powerful card in this deck that can really swing the game into our favor, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. But now that we've gone through all the non-land cards in this deck, let's quickly jump into the lands. First up, we've got Command Tower, which can tap for any of our colors, and Exotic Orchard, which can tap for any of our colors most of the time. Next up, we've got Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. And then Mirrored Landscape can actually up ramp us by paying 2 and tapping and sacrificing it. We get 2 basics that share a land type into play tapped. Next up, there's Ash Barrens, which has basic land cycling for 1. And then both Sydri Refuge and Tranquil Cove do the exact same thing. They enter the battlefield tapped, gain us 1 life, and tap for either white or blue. And then we've got 3 more lands that essentially do the exact same thing, but they tap for different colors with Scoured Barrens, Dismal Backwater, and Jawar Isle Refuge. Scoured Barrens taps for a white or a black, and the other 2 tap for either a blue or a black. And then we're going to be running our 3 Thriving lands with Thriving Heath, Thriving Isle, and Thriving Moor. Each enter the battlefield tapped and tap for 1 color, and we can choose another color for them to tap for. And then we've got the MDFC onto Inversion, which on one side is a sorcery that destroys all non-land permanents, on the other side is a simple land that taps for a white. And finally, we're going to round out this deck with 20 basic lands, 9 of which are going to be a plains, 9 will be an island, and 2 will be a swamp. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, including the lands, let's talk about the price. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck, including the commander, is less than $1. So in total, the estimated cost for this deck is $26.86. And keep in mind that that price doesn't include heavily played or damaged cards, so it could be even less than that. On top of that, that price does include basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so that's what, $2 for 20 basic lands in total, so yeah, it could be even less than that if you've already got the basic lands. Keep in mind though that this price doesn't include shipping, so that might vary depending on your location. Regardless, it's still a very effective budget build that can be a lot of fun. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.